The note cracked. Visibly, audibly, undeniably cracked, Ella Fitzgerald, 74 years old, stood on the Carnegie Hall stage and reached for a note that had been effortless for 50 years. The note that used to soar, the note that used to define what perfection sounded like, and her voice broke. Not artistically, just broke. Failed. Couldn't do what it had always done. 2,000 people in the audience held their breath. This was supposed to be a farewell concert, a celebration of an extraordinary career, but no one had expected to witness this. The moment when Ella Fitzgerald's legendary voice finally admitted what everyone knew, but no one wanted to acknowledge, it was gone. She could have stopped, could have apologized, could have walked off that stage and let the concert end early, let people remember her as she'd been rather than as she was now. But Ella Fitzgerald did something else entirely, something braver than perfect notes had ever been. She kept singing, with the broken voice, with the cracks and the weakness and the undeniable truth that she was no longer what she'd been, and what happened in the next hour became the most courageous, most human, most devastating performance of her entire career. This is the story of the night Ella Fitzgerald's voice failed her, and the night she discovered that courage sounds nothing like perfection. The year was 1991, and Ella Fitzgerald was dying, not dramatically, not suddenly, but slowly, steadily, inevitably. The diabetes that had been diagnosed years earlier had progressed despite treatment. Her eyesight was failing. She could barely read music anymore, had to memorize everything by listening. Her legs were weak, circulation problems making it hard to stand for extended periods, and worst of all for a singer, her heart was giving out, the cardiovascular disease making it impossible to support her voice the way she once had. The 3-octave range that had defined her career was gone. The upper register that used to hit notes so pure they seemed impossible simply didn't exist anymore. The breath control that had allowed her to hold notes for measures at a time was compromised by a heart that couldn't pump blood efficiently enough to support sustained singing. She knew all this. Her doctors knew it. Everyone who worked with her knew it. The woman who'd spent 7 years making music had maybe a year left, possibly less. And her voice, the instrument that had made her legendary, was already gone. The sensible thing would have been to retire quietly. Stop performing before the decline became public. Let people remember the Ella Fitzgerald of the songbook recordings, the perfect pitch, the effortless scatting, the voice that could do anything. Preserve the legend by refusing to let anyone see the human reality underneath. But Ella had one more concert scheduled. Carnegie Hall, June 1991, a farewell concert that her management had booked months earlier before anyone realized how bad things had gotten. She could cancel. Her health was reason enough. Everyone would understand. The tickets would be refunded. People would be disappointed but sympathetic. Instead, she decided to perform. Against her doctor's advice. Against the pleading of her manager, who didn't want her final public appearance to damage the careful legacy they'd built. Against common sense and pride and the preservation instinct that tells us to hide our weaknesses rather than expose them. "I want to sing one more time," she told them. "One more time at Carnegie Hall. Let them see what's real." The decision terrified everyone around her. What if she collapsed on stage? What if the performance was so bad it overshadowed everything she'd accomplished? What if people left remembering not the legend, but the sad final decline? But Ella was certain. She'd spent 57 years being perfect, being the greatest, being the voice that never failed. And now, at the very end, she wanted to be human. She wanted to show what it meant to keep making music even when perfection was impossible. She wanted her final gift to be truth rather than preservation of a carefully maintained image. The night of the concert, Carnegie Hall was sold out. 2,000 people who'd bought tickets months in advance expecting a celebration. A retrospective of an extraordinary career, probably some reduced capacity performances. Everyone knew Ella wasn't what she'd been, but still Ella Fitzgerald at Carnegie Hall was an event worth attending. What they didn't know, what couldn't have been communicated in any concert promotion, was that they were about to witness something far more profound than a greatest hits performance. They were about to see an artist choosing vulnerability over preservation, humanity over legend. Backstage, Ella sat in her dressing room struggling to breathe normally. The simple act of getting ready for the performance had exhausted her. Her assistant had helped her into the elegant gown she'd chosen, ocean blue, her favorite color, fitted to hide how much weight the illness had taken from her frame. The makeup took longer than usual because her hands shook too much to apply it herself. She looked at herself in the mirror and saw a stranger. Or maybe not a stranger. Maybe just herself without all the professional armor. 74 years old, sick, dying, but still here. Still determined to sing. Her accompanist knocked softly on the door. 5 minutes, Miss Fitzgerald. She nodded. Took a breath as deep as her compromised lungs would allow. This was it. The last time she'd stand on a stage and try to make music. The last time she'd face an audience expecting excellence from a body that could no longer provide it. The walk from the dressing room to the stage felt like miles. Her legs hurt. Her breathing was labored. A wheelchair stood ready in the wings. They discussed having her perform seated, but Ella had refused. If this was her final concert, she'd stand, even if standing hurt, even if it made everything harder. The audience applause when she walked onto the Carnegie Hall stage was thunderous. Standing ovation before she'd sung a single note, 2,000 people on their feet celebrating the legend, the career, the voice that had defined jazz vocal performance for generations. Ella stood at the microphone, waiting for the applause to subside, and felt the weight of what she was about to do. These people expected something. Expected her, even diminished, to still be Ella Fitzgerald, to still carry some echo of the brilliance that had made her name synonymous with vocal perfection. She couldn't give them that. That person, that voice was gone. All she had left was the truth, and the courage to share it. "Thank you," she said softly. Her speaking voice was weak too. Another thing the illness had taken. "Thank you for being here tonight, for being with me one more time." The audience settled into their seats. The accompanist began the introduction to Summertime, the Gershwin standard she'd sung thousands of times. A safe choice. A familiar song where even a compromised performance would be recognizable. Ella began to sing, and immediately anyone who knew her work could hear the difference. The voice was thin where it used to be rich, breathy where it used to be clear. The pitch wavered on sustained notes that she used to hold with mathematical precision. After 16 bars, her voice cracked completely on a note she'd hit perfectly in 1,000 previous performances. Just broke. Failed. Stopped working. The audience stirred uncomfortably. This wasn't what they'd expected. This wasn't diminished Ella. This was broken Ella. This was an artist who could no longer do what she'd built an entire career on doing perfectly. Ella stopped singing. Let the accompaniment continue for a moment while she caught her breath. 2,000 people watched in painful silence, wondering if she'd be able to continue, wondering if they should applaud supportively or sit quietly, or what the appropriate response was to watching a legend publicly fail. Then Ella did something unexpected. She smiled. Not a sad smile. Not an apologetic smile, but a genuine smile of recognition, like she just understood something important. "I used to be able to hit that note," she said to the audience. Her speaking voice was quiet, but carried clearly in the excellent acoustics of Carnegie Hall. "Used to be easy. Now it's not, but we're going to keep going anyway." And she did. She kept singing. Without the note that had broken. Without trying to force her voice to do what it couldn't anymore. She adjusted. Simplified. Changed the melody to accommodate what her voice could still accomplish rather than insisting on perfection it could no longer achieve. What emerged wasn't perfect. Wasn't even technically good by the standards she'd set throughout her career, but it was real in a way that perfection had never been. It was a 74-year-old woman with a failing body choosing to make music anyway, choosing to share what she had left rather than hiding what she'd lost. The audience began to understand what they were witnessing. This wasn't a greatest hits performance. This wasn't a celebration of past glories. This was something entirely different. This was an artist showing them what it looked like to continue creating even when the tools you'd relied on were gone, what it meant to choose music over pride, humanity over legend. As the concert progressed, Ella's voice failed repeatedly. Notes that should have soared barely lifted. Sustained passages became shorter, broken into smaller phrases to accommodate lungs that couldn't support long melodic lines. The 3-octave range had shrunk to barely 2, and even those 2 octaves were unreliable. But something else emerged in place of technical perfection, an emotional honesty that made people lean forward in their seats. The lyrics of songs she'd sung for decades suddenly carried new weight. When she sang, "Someone to Watch Over Me," everyone in that room understood that she wasn't just performing a standard, she was expressing a genuine longing for comfort in the face of mortality. The scat singing, which had been her signature for so long, was impossible now. The quick runs and elaborate improvisations required breath and control she no longer possessed. Instead, she sang simpler melodies, straighter interpretations of the written music, and somehow that simplicity was more moving than all the technical brilliance had ever been. Halfway through the concert, Ella had to sit down. Her legs wouldn't support her anymore. The stage crew brought out a stool, positioned it carefully at the microphone. She sat, breathing heavily, taking a moment to recover before continuing. "I'm sorry," she said to the audience. "I used to be able to do this standing up. Everything gets harder when you get old." Someone in the audience started clapping, then another person, then the entire hall erupted in applause. Not polite acknowledgement, not sympathy, but genuine appreciation for her honesty, for her willingness to be human in front of them. Ella waited for the applause to fade, then continued singing. Seated now, but still present, still making music with whatever capacity remained, there was a moment about 3/4 through the concert when it seemed like she might not be able to continue. She started "My Funny Valentine," and her voice simply gave out completely. Not a crack, not a weakness, just gone. Nothing emerged when she tried to sing. She stopped, sat in silence for what felt like a long time but was probably only 30 seconds. The audience was completely quiet, waiting, hoping, praying maybe that she'd find a way to continue. Then Ella spoke instead of sang. "This song," she said, her speaking voice barely above a whisper, "has always been about loving someone despite their imperfections, about seeing beauty in the broken places." She paused. "I can't sing it tonight, not the way it deserves, but maybe that's appropriate. Maybe that's what the song has been teaching all along." The audience sat in stunned silence. No one was crying yet, but it was coming. Everyone could feel it building. This woman, this legend, this artist who'd given them 50 years of perfection, was now giving them something far more valuable: the permission to be imperfect, the example of continuing even when you can't be excellent, the courage of vulnerability. She tried the song again. This time her voice came back, thin and fragile but present. She made it through the first verse, adjusting the melody constantly to accommodate what her body could do. It wasn't pretty by conventional standards, but it was honest, it was true, and it was devastating in its humanity. By the final third of the concert, people in the audience were openly crying, not because the performance was bad, though by Ella's own standards it certainly was, but because they were witnessing something far more profound than technical excellence. They were watching an artist strip away everything performative and show them the bare human truth underneath. When Ella sang "Over the Rainbow," her voice cracking on the high notes, barely maintaining pitch on the sustained passages, everyone in Carnegie Hall understood what they were hearing. This wasn't about wishful dreaming anymore. This was about accepting what is, about finding peace with limitations, about the courage required to keep hoping even when hope seems foolish. The final song of the concert was "Somewhere Over the Rainbow." Ella had discussed the set list with her accompanist beforehand and insisted on ending with this one. Not because it showcased her voice, it couldn't not anymore, but because the lyrics meant something to her now that they never had before. She sang it simply, no embellishments, no scat singing, no technical displays, just the melody and the words delivered by a woman who knew she was singing her final public performance. Who knew that "Somewhere Over the Rainbow" wasn't just a metaphor anymore, but a literal description of where she was headed. When the final note faded, the Carnegie Hall audience didn't applaud immediately. They sat in complete silence, processing what they just witnessed. Then, slowly, people began to stand, one person, then two, 10, then everyone. The standing ovation lasted 7 minutes. People were crying openly, unashamed. They weren't applauding technical excellence. There hadn't been any. They were applauding courage. They were applauding humanity. They were applauding an artist who'd chosen truth over preservation of a carefully maintained image. Ella sat on her stool, exhausted beyond measure, tears running down her face, accepting the appreciation for what she'd given them. Not perfection, not the voice that used to soar, but something far more valuable: the example of continuing despite failure, the gift of vulnerability offered freely. After the concert, after the audience had reluctantly filed out and the Carnegie Hall stage had emptied, Ella sat in her dressing room, unable to move. The performance had taken everything she had. Her assistant brought water, oxygen, medication. The doctor who'd been standing by backstage checked her vitals and shook his head with concern. "You shouldn't have done this," he said, but there was admiration in his voice alongside the medical worry. "I had to. Ella said simply. One more time, let them see what's real. The reviews the next day were unlike anything written about her before. Critics struggled to find language for what they'd witnessed. How do you review a performance that fails by every technical standard but succeeds as human expression? How do you critique an artist who deliberately chooses vulnerability over excellence? One critic wrote, Ella Fitzgerald's voice is gone, but what she showed us last night at Carnegie Hall was far more important than voice ever was. She showed us what it means to be human, to fail, to continue anyway, to choose honesty over preservation of legend. It was the bravest performance I have ever witnessed. The concert recording was never officially released. Ella's estate felt it didn't represent her at her best, but bootleg recordings circulated among musicians and serious fans. And those who heard it understood this was Ella Fitzgerald's masterpiece. Not the songbook recordings, not the perfect pitch performances, but this final concert where she let everyone see the truth. Ella Fitzgerald died 15 months later in June 1996. The diabetes and heart disease that had ravaged her body finally won, but before she died, she'd given one final gift to the world: the permission to be imperfect, the example of vulnerability as strength, the proof that music isn't about perfection but about truth. Musicians who saw that final concert or heard the bootleg recordings talk about it in reverent tones. She taught us that the courage to fail is more important than the ability to succeed, one vocalist said. She showed us that music isn't about showing off what you can do. It's about sharing what's true, even when the truth is broken and fragile. The final concert at Carnegie Hall completed a circle that began at the Apollo Theater in 1934. A 17-year-old Ella had frozen on stage, unable to dance, forced by fear to sing instead. A 74-year-old Ella stood on stage, unable to sing the way she once had, forced by time to show humanity instead. Both moments required courage. But the final concert required something the first one didn't: the courage to let people see you fail, the courage to be imperfect in front of thousands, the courage to choose truth over legend. That's the real legacy of Ella Fitzgerald's final concert. Not that her voice had failed. Everyone gets old, everyone's body betrays them eventually, but that she chose to share that failure publicly, that she stood on the most prestigious stage in America and showed everyone what it looks like when excellence becomes impossible and you make music anyway. The voice that could do anything finally admitted it couldn't. And in that admission, in that vulnerability, in that profound humanity, Ella Fitzgerald gave her final and perhaps greatest performance. She sang with a broken instrument and showed the world that courage sounds nothing like perfection. It sounds like continuing, like trying, like refusing to hide even when hiding would be easier. 2,000 people watched the voice break, and 2,000 people learned that music isn't about the notes you hit, it's about the truth you tell. Even when that truth is painful, even when that truth reveals weakness, even when that truth destroys the legend you've spent a lifetime building. Ella Fitzgerald's voice broke at Carnegie Hall, but what emerged from that breaking was more valuable than perfection had ever been: the gift of human truth, the permission to be fragile, the example of courage that has nothing to do with success and everything to do with choosing to continue despite failure. That's what made it the bravest performance of her career, not because it was good, but because it was real